Chapter 15, Documentation. If you've been following the news lately, you're aware that Brexit looms on the horizon. You may not be aware that pundits are predicting that Brexit will result in a flurry of additional paperwork for those who wish to export from the UK. Indeed, prior to Brexit, it could require as many as 100 documents to export from the UK to another European country. The single market removed such customs controls and the need for so many shipping documents. At the end of the discussion, you'll have a chance to opine on Brexit, but it brings up a very good question, which is about documentation. So we'll look at documentation, and specifically, however, we'll look at it from a U.S. perspective with the assumption that you're exporting from the United States. So we'll look at the standard trade documents and their purposes, how to prepare some of the important documents, some tips and thoughts, a bit on NAFTA, differentiating between different types of bills of lading, and then, as I said at the end, you'll have a chance in the discussion forum to talk about Brexit. So let's move on. There are a number of documents to be aware of, and your chapter does a good job of discussing those, so I will refer you to that. However, I want to flesh out the 9 that are highlighted, namely the quotation, pro forma invoice, commercial invoice, packing list, EEI, or electronic export information, which replaces the SED, or Shipper's Export Declaration, used in the past. The bill of lading, or airway bill, certificate of origin, or COO, insurance certificate, and draft. And to mix things up a little bit and make it a bit more interesting, I created a Quizlet. So if you go to this address, it'll bring you to it automatically. And it's a good way of quizzing yourself on those 9 terms. So I don't know if you've used Quizlet before, but it's kind of fun. You can have it show you flashcards with the terms. It can quiz you on them. It can spell them for you. You can quiz you on spelling them. You can take a test. You can do matching. So what I had initially envisioned was having you do the matching on this, but you're welcome to do whatever of the games appeals to you. This is the matching exercise, where it's essentially a drag and drop, where you drag the term onto its definition. And if it doesn't like the definition that you tried to match it with, it won't let you. So, for instance, does that look like certificate of origin? Yes, evidently it does. So let's look at one that we know is wrong. How about this one? Nope, says that's not going to work. So please do take the time to do the Quizlet. I think you'll find that an interesting way of reviewing the major trade documents. But let's move forward. Okay. As you're probably aware by now, preparing an export sales quote for international will probably entail more detail than your domestic shipments. And in fact, obviously you need to include the sellers and buyers' names and addresses, the buyer's reference number, and the date of inquiry, a listing of the products and their descriptions, and as was pointed out in your text, be sure to include weights and measurements and packaging, the price. And you may want to quote in US dollars. As we said, the dimensions and the weight, a trade discount if there is one, the delivery point, terms of sale, terms of payment, insurance and shipping costs, how long the quote is valid for. Fortunately, your author makes a point of that as well. The total charges and the estimated shipping date. And as we said, if you're quoting in US dollars, that might make it a bit easier. Otherwise, you need to indicate the currency of the sale. The pro forma invoice also would probably be a bit more detailed than what you're doing domestically. And the pro forma invoice is often used by foreign governments if they need to, if the importer needs to obtain an import license. So it's a more formal, recognized document. As I said earlier, the EEI, or Electronic Export Information, replaces the shipper's export declaration. And it's required for products that exceed $2,500 in value. And it's also required regardless of the value if you're shipping a product that requires a U.S. export license. And in the next section, we'll talk a little bit more about that and about controlled products. They're in the process of moving to what's called ACE, or Automated Commercial Environment, which is a single window, kind of one-stop shopping. So let me show you a little bit more detail on that. So hopefully that will make life a little bit easier for exporters. I think your author does a fairly good job talking about what products qualify for NAFTA, so I won't belabor that point. NAFTA can be a little bit challenging. The pundits say that it does need new impetus. When it was first signed in, it caused a significant productivity jump, especially in northern Mexico and Canada, but it's things have slowed down, kind of leveled out in recent years. It hasn't really kept up with things like e-commerce as well as one might hope. The proposed TPP does a better job with that. So the NAFTA, as it's currently enacted, does require a bit more paperwork, as you're aware of the NAFTA Certificate of Origin. You can have goods fall under the NAFTA if they have less than 50% foreign content, in other words, content outside of the NAFTA. But as was pointed out by your author, there are fairly specific rules for that. If you have a complicated situation, you are encouraged to contact the Census Bureau, and they are more than happy to help you sort that out. Last but not quite least, is differentiating between negotiable and non-negotiable bills of lading. In Chapter 16, we'll look at letters of credit, and I think the idea of negotiable bills of lading will make a little bit more sense then, because those are negotiable bills of lading are needed to make the letter of credit work. A non-negotiable bill of lading is straightforward. A negotiable one, however, can be bought, sold, or traded while the goods are in transit. And then, of course, the customer needs the original as proof of ownership to take possession of the goods. And I look forward to your thoughts on the Brexit.